We are now ready for our next illustrious speaker, whom I'm delighted to introduce and have just been introduced to myself. And this is Robert Grillo, the founder and director of a great organization out of Chicago called Free From Harm. Now, Robert and I already do know each other because we are always in contact on the internet. Robert is a great writer. He writes beautiful, wonderful blogs, and we've shared so many wonderful stories and experiences as activists on behalf of chickens and other farmed animals and farmed animal issues and vegetarian, vegan issues. And so I know we know each other, but today we actually were introduced in real life. So it's my great joy to introduce to you Robert Grillo, who, as I said, is the director of Free From Harm, which is a nonprofit animal rescue, education, and advocacy organization. Robert Grillo has a professional background as a creative consultant and integrates his 20 years of marketing and design experience as part of his animal advocacy strategy. Robert lives, is that the right word? Oh, loves. Sorry, a little dark in here. Robert loves exploring the outdoors, hiking, not fishing, okay? Hiking, biking, relaxing in cafes, and creative vegan cooking. So, without further ado, it is my joy to introduce to you Robert Grillo. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Karen, for that introduction. And I am so delighted to be here today. We just had a winter in Chicago that lasted about 4 months. So this is my first opportunity to be outside of Chicago through that horrible winter we just had. And I can't tell you how great it is to be in the climate right now. But I'm also just really honored to be at this conference because I have the utmost respect for Karen Davis and Hope Bohanec and the organizers and sponsors of this event. It's really special to be a speaker here this year. For the better part of the last 20 years, I've been involved in marketing, branding, and design. And is the microphone okay? Yeah. Do we need a little more volume? So I started out as a freelance graphic artist about 20 years ago, and I would take different jobs at ad agencies around Chicago. The work was pretty plentiful. I didn't think too much about what I was working on. At one point, I worked on McDonald's Happy Meal boxes. And, you know, the work was there. I didn't really think too much about it. Well, lots changed in those 20 years. I no longer work on Happy Meal boxes, for one thing. But the biggest change is that there's a big irony attached to the change, really, that I've come to become a critic of the whole message and image building industry that I made a living off of for many years. And I became somewhat of a watchdog of this image and message building industry. And about 5 years ago, I decided to take up the cause of animal advocacy. And when I did so, I realized off the bat that there were 4 important things that I could leverage from my work to strengthen my advocacy. The first was obviously my marketing, design, and branding experience. The second, though, was something that took a little longer, a little bit more thinking. But I realized that the lens of popular culture through which we see farmed animals is incredibly and grossly distorted. And it creates a caricature out of its subjects. It marginalizes and denigrates and trivializes its subjects. And ultimately, it's shaped around the industries that seek to exploit animals for their gain. But most importantly, it seeks to win the public's hearts and minds to this view of animals continuously and incessantly through all of the messages and narratives and images that it puts out there. The third thing that I noticed right off the bat was that most people don't see that there's a distortion. The public isn't aware that there's a distortion because there's really nothing to compare this to. It's all around us. Our whole world is filled with this until we get to meet those who are actually being misrepresented by popular culture. And those, of course, are the animals. So when we get to meet these animals on their own terms, in their own environment, such as on a sanctuary where we can get to know them as the individuals that they truly are, then all of a sudden we gain a new perspective and we can compare and contrast that with what we've been fed through popular culture. The fourth thing I realized was that the work that I must do for animals is to help people see and compare the fictional side from popular culture with a more truthful, authentic side that I was able to capture, I and others that I've gotten to know in the course of the last 5 years, that can present and capture a more authentic and truthful side of the animals and the relationships that we have with farmed animals. I firmly believe that by doing this kind of comparison and contrast, that we can really change, this can help change the prevailing attitudes and beliefs that we have about animals and our food and the relationships we have with animals. These are beliefs and attitudes that perpetuate misrepresentation and exploitation and suffering. So I'm here today to essentially talk to and shine a light on how popular culture shapes our beliefs and attitudes about animals and food and our relationship with animals in very powerful and yet intentionally elusive ways, so that we don't really question what's being presented. We just assimilate it in a way that you know, is almost kind of subliminal at times. After time, these images, narratives, and messages from popular culture, they become so ingrained and reinforced in our minds that we just accept them as facts. But then later, if we question where these facts come from, then we see that they've been borrowed or inherited from popular culture, or from a previous generation, like our parents' generation or our grandparents' generation. So before I begin, I just want to point out, I want to cite an example just to get a sense of just how powerful these influences are in our lives. So let's just take a look at the advertising marketing budget of the largest meat industry player, Cargill. In 2012, Cargill spent $1,792 million just on promoting animal products to consumers around the world. The largest animal advocacy organization in that same year spent a fraction of its $500,000 outreach budget to help farmed animals in some way. So these statistics I just want to point out are from a website called countinganimals.com, which uses USDA and government and also trade industry statistics. It's a very good site for those that are interested in the numbers. So I'd like to start with a few historical examples. I picked this image of Krishna milking the cow because it gives us a really strong historical context of the sacred cow in an ancient tradition. As you can see here, the calves are very content. They look like they've already been fed. The mother cow is very willing and consensual to giving her milk to Krishna, just as if Krishna were her own young. So the cow becomes a sacred cow, but she also becomes a symbol of nourishment, and she has a certain utility in their culture. And in Western cultures, this myth, this legend translates very very easily. You often hear of farmers that say that they treat their cows and calves like their own family, like members of their own family. At least I hear this quite a bit. And the strongest suggestion, though, is that cows willingly give of their milk, like fruit falls from, pieces of fruit fall from the tree when they're ripe. So if this is the fictional legend side of the truth, then what is the truth? And who is being misrepresented by this? I'd like to introduce you to one of them. Her name is Lily. Lily is a milking cow. She's part of a milking program at Wagner Farm, which is a working dairy farm outside of Chicago. It is a taxpayer-funded facility. It's a historical museum and petting zoo, and has become a darling of the locavore movement. And Lily is one of those cows that was born into this program through artificial insemination. She's one of those cows that really resisted being forced to do this. And oftentimes she would be seen dragged from the barn into the milking parlor. She really didn't want to give her milk. And in fact, when they brought her in to this milking parlor, which is where the kids and the families get to see how the cows are milked with machines and also by hand, she had to be constrained in what the industry often refers to as a rape rack. And I mean, I think you can pretty much see by the expression on her face that she really doesn't want to be any part of this. This is Lily back in her stall. She's been a bad girl, so she's separated from all the other cows on the pasture, and she has a little window where she can look out at them. But it's a lot easier for them to just go into the stall when they need to do the milking program and the kids are there than have to go out on pasture and try to drag her in from pasture. So they just keep her in the stall for several months on her own. She's had 2 babies stolen from her, and she's described by the woman who really watches over her every day as having her spirit broken after a few months of all of this. So again, the expression on her face, I think, is pretty telling. Another historical example I've got here is the Strong America poster series. These posters came out of the World War I, World War II era, and they became kind of a foundation for the milk and meat industry to really promote and unify, solidify the idea that cow's milk, the mammary gland secretions of another animal, is the strength and unifying substance, resource of our economy and our culture. And you can see how the melting pot is emphasized here with all the different ethnic groups. So milk is the source of strength in our nation. Does anyone recognize this film still? No? Oh, I see. Didn't hear you the first time, sorry. It's Rebel Without a Cause, and that's James Dean. Has anyone seen the film? Okay, and did anyone walk away from this film thinking that chickens and the reputation of chickens was the focal point of the film? So that's exactly why I included it here, because the messaging is so subtle and yet so powerful that I'm pretty sure no one walked away thinking that this was about denigrating chickens. But in fact, the film centers around a scene, a plot of what's called a chicken run. And what happens is James Dean is taunted by his classmates, and he's called a chicken and a coward, and they say, come on, you got to do this race. And the chicken run is where you run your car off a cliff and you try to jump out of the car before the car goes over the cliff. And whoever jumps out first is the chicken. The second person, if they make it jump out last and they win. Well, what happened here is he jumped out first. The other guy couldn't get out of the car in time and went over the cliff. So then in the next scene, James Dean goes back to his parents and tells them what happened. And they're like, oh my God, you know, how could you do this? How could you get involved in such a, you know, a stupid stunt? And he says, well, they were taunting me as a chicken. And, you know, he wouldn't take that. So what's interesting is the Merriam-Webster dictionary, one of the definitions of chicken is a person who is afraid. Okay, so this is the fictional side of what chickens represent in popular culture, and even in a progressive film like Rebel Without a Cause, which was quite a groundbreaking film for the time. The truth is that chickens are really very brave birds. Roosters display valiant courage in protecting their flock. Alpha females and males are very protective of the submissive members of the flock often, and mother hens are fiercely protective of their young in many cases. So in Rebel Without a Cause, the chicken becomes the opposite, becomes the coward, the inferior one, the weaker one, the persecuted one. So of course, denigrating chickens makes it a lot easier to do this when we can represent them and misrepresent them in this way. This is a postcard of the Chicago Stockyards. The history books celebrate the Chicago Stockyards as the birth of industrial agriculture. The Union Stockyard was the largest meatpacking facility in America for decades, starting in 1865. The district was operated by a group of railroad companies that acquired swampland and turned it into an enormous industrialized meatpacking and slaughter complex. This souvenir postcard here shows how heavily the city promoted its reputation as, quote, the hog butcher to the world, end quote. And even the stockyards where the killing was going on and the bloodshed, there were tours that people could walk through. From the Civil War through the 1920s, more meat was processed in Chicago than anywhere in the world. So here you have an early example of a fictional narrative that was created to associate economic prosperity and industrial revolution, all the positive connotations to that, connected with exploitation and industrialized violence and killing. So bringing us back up to current times, I thought this would be kind of an interesting transition. Because as some of you might see right off the bat, if you haven't seen this, but if you have, you might know more about it. But it's a New York Times piece. It's a photo styled after the famous Norman Rockwell piece of a Thanksgiving Day turkey dinner. And the symbolism, there's a lot of heavy symbolism of Norman Rockwell's work, which is, you know, the importance of home and community and family and tradition and American culture. But this photo connects that with the virtue of eating the whole hog, we often use that phrase, the whole hog. I think it's a good example of how popular culture and a popular myth that we see in popular culture that we shouldn't waste. That sounds like a good thing. You know, wasting isn't a good thing. But this takes way beyond just not wasting food. It's really saying that the animal is somehow honored if we eat all of its body parts. And of course, again, you have the complicit nature of the animal, who's even dead, but looking pretty contentedly into the camera or into the focal point with a smiling, content look on his face. This also, I think, plays into the myth that a woman's, a wife, mother's role is to prepare and then put the meat on the table. And if she doesn't do this, that she's somehow betraying her role. So interesting, though, is that if we were really concerned about waste, then we probably wouldn't be eating animal products to begin with, because if we look at the environmental impact of meat versus plant foods, we'd find that there's a lot more waste that goes onto water and other resources when we eat animal foods. So if we really cared about wasting, we'd probably be eating more plants. So again, I'll ask, who's being misrepresented by the New York Times? And I'll introduce you to a couple of them here. I had the great pleasure of visiting the Precious Life Animal Sanctuary in Sequim, Washington last fall. And I got to meet the owners, Ralph and his wife, Carol, who's not pictured here. Vegans in their 70s who've been managing this small sanctuary for many years. And two of the pigs there are Fluffy on the bottom. Fluffy is a blind and deaf pig. And Wilbert, to the right, is his guardian. Follows him and makes sure that he's always by his side. And Ralph just has this magical kind of relationship with these pigs. Has anyone seen this film? In this film by HBO, Temple Grandin is presented as a heroine, a great advocate for animals. And of course, that's what most of the public believes. This film did a great job of manufacturing that image and that perception of her. Even vegetarians I know have come to me and say, wow, isn't she a great person? Hasn't she made a great contribution? Grandin was interviewed on NPR a couple of years ago, and she was asked, well, why do you think it's okay to eat animals? If you love animals and you've devoted your life to trying to help them, as you claim, why do you think it's okay to eat them? And she said, quote, I also think about the hyenas ripping the guts out of something. And that did not happen to that steak. The way that wolves kill things is not that nice. Cats will kill you first, but wolves will just rip you open and dine on your live guts. End quote. So she didn't answer the question. Instead, she invoked a common naturalistic fallacy, which is connecting humans who are not obligate carnivores or obligate omnivores. They are omnivores, and they can eat meat and plants and survive off of both, but they are not obligate omnivores in the sense that they must have meat to survive. So comparing animals that kill as they need to survive with us is obviously an unjust comparison, right? So if HBO represents, and if this film represents the fictional side associated with Grandin, then what is the truth? Well, if you do a little bit of research and you go into the trade publications, you can dig around a little bit on their websites, what you'll find is that she's a major spokesperson for organizations like the American Meat Institute, which is the largest meat industry trade organization in our country. She gets a paycheck from them. She is represented in many of their marketing pieces and literature. She's the narrator in some of their videos, and she's also the keynote speaker at some of their animal handling and care conferences. So again, the fiction that HBO presents here is that Grandin is a savior to animals, but the truth is that she's paid for by the meat industry, and she willingly endorses a fundamental disconnect in our culture that consuming some animals is fine while we say we have an alleged love for others. I think that this ad campaign may finally be coming to an end. But it has been active for an incredibly long time. In fact, it is perhaps the most costly, long-standing, and arguably the most effective ad campaign in history. There was even a PBS documentary made about the ad agency in New York that created this ad campaign. That's how famous it is around the world. There's a lot going on in this ad, but I'm just going to point out a few things that strike me. The first is the blurring of distinction between a mother's milk and cow's milk, a human mother's milk and cow's milk. It suggests that drinking the milk of another species is as natural as breastfeeding your own babies. And it even suggests that an adult human mother can be and should be nurtured by the milk of another lactating female of another species. Oops, sorry. Not done yet. So if this is the fiction, the mythical side of drinking milk and, from the dairy industry itself, then what is the truth? Well, I'm going to read you a quote from Will Tuttle because I like the way he kind of sums it up. He says, fundamentally, cow's milk is a substance designed by nature for baby cows, not for humans. We are the only species that drinks the milk intended for the young of other species. And we are the only species that insists on drinking milk beyond the time of weaning. Perhaps we long for infancy and the peaceful oblivion of our mother's breast. And if hers isn't available, then we'll use the breast of any lactating mother, even if she's a cow, and even if we have to kill her babies to get to it. The other tragic truth about cow's milk is that even her young will be weaned off of her milk within a year or so, and move on to solid food. But we are told that it's perfectly normal and natural to drink milk into adulthood. Everybody's probably heard of the Lady Gaga meat dress, which was, a phenomenon a couple of years ago. It's not a new thing, but there's actually been a lot of other things that in Lady Gaga's persona and in her performances that tie meat and meat consumption with her stardom. And there's also been a book written about her new brand of feminism. And I find this very interesting. I think that there's something going on here a lot more than just shock value. That's what some people will write it off as and say, oh, it's just so that she can get more ratings and that the record companies can get more ratings and more sales. But what I keep asking myself is, why does the media associate meat, fashion, and female stardom? Well, Carol Adams, who wrote The Sexual Politics of Meat, which I think is a really groundbreaking book that was written many years ago and has been updated many times since, I think has some very keen insights on answering that question. I'm going to read you a quote from her book. She says, "Objectification permits the oppressor to view another being as an object. The oppressor then violates this being with object-like treatment, e.g., the rape of women that denies women freedom to say no, or the butchering of animals that converts animals from living, breathing beings to dead objects. This process allows fragmentation, brutal dismemberment, and finally, consumption. Consumption is the fulfillment of oppression, the annihilation of will." She also writes later in the book, "Just as the slaughterhouse treats animals and its workers as inert, unthinking, and unfeeling objects, so too in rape are women treated as inert objects, with no attention paid to their feelings or needs. Consequently, they feel like pieces of meat. To feel like a piece of meat is to be treated like an inert object, when one is, or was, a living, feeling being." A couple of years ago, the Smithsonian came out with a feature story called How the Chicken Conquered the World. I like this because I don't like it. I picked it. I picked it because I think it's a great example of how popular culture can turn the victim into a hero. The real perpetrator, which is of course the human being or the real conqueror, is absent. The Smithsonian, it's important to note, I think, that the Smithsonian is perceived as an authoritative source of journalism by many people. They see it as, you know, part of an institution in our culture that promotes a solid understanding of history and American culture. This piece claims to be a factual history of chickens, citing leading archaeologists as sources. To quote the author, "The epic begins 10,000 years ago in an Asian jungle and ends today in kitchens all over the world." So let's think about this for a moment. The Smithsonian would have us believe that 40 billion chickens killed every year as essentially 6-week-old babies that end up on people's plates is something to be celebrated as a way that chickens are conquering the world. I mean, this is just surreal. It's a history that turns the most abused and exploited species on the planet into something of a celebration or a victory for chickens. If she can't stay pregnant, what else will she do? That's the headline for this pharmaceutical ad for dairy cows. Does that sound familiar? When I posted this on Facebook with a caption, a friend of a friend who claimed to have a PhD said she was very resentful of me comparing human females with a female cow. She'd worked very hard in her life to get where she is, and she felt that that was really insulting. I responded by saying, you know, don't shoot the messenger, look at the ad. The ad compares an era in which women were preferred by men to be barefoot and pregnant and at home. And they're just applying the same kind of misogyny and sexism to females of another species. The other myth that's being reinforced here is that cows, again, willingly give their milk, just like in that iconic Krishna image with the cow. And this is how modern agriculture interprets that same Krishna-type myth. Artisone is a food delivery service that's based in Israel, but they started out in Chicago. So I don't know what that's all about. But anyway, their first ad campaign that just made a huge splash in Chicago, and it's all over. There's TV commercials, there's billboards, there's bus signage, everywhere you look, is this running dead chicken, headless chicken corpse dancing around in the video to deliver groceries. Again, surreal is not even the appropriate word to describe it, but I'm not even kind of alluding to that here. I want to point out why this ad strikes me is that it's blurring the distinctions between animals and plants in a very, not so subtle way. Joel Salatin of Polyface Farm was recently in a debate on Intelligence Squared. Joel Salatin, as you know, is one of the kingpins of the alternative animal farming movement. And he was in a debate on the ethics of eating animals. And he exclaimed early on, he said, well, even potatoes have faces, so we're going to have a problem here tonight. So this ad, of course, reinforces that. That maybe that's where he got the idea. Michael Pollan wrote a piece a few months ago in The New Yorker about the theories of plant sentience. Now, even though he didn't draw any conclusions about whether plants are sentient or whether they have any it should have any moral standing as animals do in our society, the implication is still there that chopping the head off a stalk of broccoli is morally equivalent to chopping the head off of a fully conscious chicken. So again, I'm going to ask, if these are the fictions, if these are the fictions that people like Pollen and Salatin and Artisone, companies like Artisone, are promoting, then what's the truth and who's being misrepresented? Here's another one. This is one of our heroines, Melissa Summer Pena. She does an incredible amount of rescue on her own, but she's also done a lot for Free From Harm. And this is a photo of her with a little piglet that she got out of Chicago Animal Control, which is a kill shelter that has thousands of animals at any given time. And she fostered the piglet for 3 days before she found him a forever home somewhere in downstate Illinois. But she developed a really beautiful relationship with him in just a few days, and he clearly fell in love with her, as you can see. Last year, Whole Foods Market came out with what they called We Are Earthlings, an Earthlings campaign, and it was quite prominent. We saw it in all the stores and on the website and in print materials. Of course, the campaign is all about the artisans and the interesting people behind these incredible artisan foods. And what's striking about this is the Good Shepherd trope. Here you have an idea, a myth that goes back to biblical times, literally, and beyond that. And so we kind of launched our own kind of impromptu counter campaign and started flooding Whole Foods Market Facebook page and email and calling and asking, when are they going to show that film Earthlings? Because to us, that's what they were doing. And they said, oh, no, we're not affiliated with the film at all. And I said, oh, we said, that's interesting because have you thought about showing it? We just... Finally, I think we got to him, or I don't know if we can really take the credit for it, but all of a sudden the campaign mysteriously disappeared. And I'd like to think we had something to do with that, but I can't say for sure. This is an ad and a poster. It was a trade ad, too, put out by United Egg Producers and Humane Society of the United States. That suggested that the problem with egg-laying hens is a problem of housing, and giving them a few inches or even less is the solution. And of course, there's a bill. The bill in California was what this was promoting to try to get people to vote for that bill in California. There are, of course, numerous problems with egg and cruelties with egg-laying hens that are standard practice in egg farming today. The proposed plan presented here would simply give hens a little bit more space and perhaps a few accommodations. I don't even want to use that word because they're really not, that's not really a good word. But anyway, the ad claims that it's good for hens up there. It doesn't really give a reason. It just says because it's endorsed by all these different animal groups. So if this is a fiction, as I'm suggesting it is, then who is being misrepresented here again? I've got two of them here. One that we're going to focus on is the one on the right. Her name is Beatrice. Beatrice was rescued from one of the new and improved and rich colony cage systems in the United Kingdom that is now in use today. And it is very much similar to the one that was in the United Egg Producers bill, the same kind of cage system. Justine, who we've interviewed and talked to about Beatrice and other rescues, say that the hens that come out of these new cages, these new and improved cages, are just as sick and miserable or more than those from the old cage system. This is Beatrice on her day of rescue. It's the first time out of a cage. She lived 3 weeks outside of a cage. She was a very sickly hen. The last image, the last piece I have for you is the Flickin' Chicken game, which I discovered, kind of stumbled upon in a high-end arts and crafts shop. I know. This is really a shocker. But by my house is a strip called Clark Street, and there's a lot of kind of independent shops and cafes, and it's kind of an interesting mix of stuff. But I'm not into arts and crafts, but in this particular evening, we just kind of walked by and said, okay, we'll just go in and take a quick look around. And I found this, and I took a photo of it, and when I came home later that night, I decided to send an email to the store manager. And I asked them, I attached 2 photos to the message, this one and this one. This is Danita, who unfortunately is being hospitalized right now, and Sweet Pea. They were very close. Sweet Pea is no longer with us. And I asked them 2 questions. I said, first of all, which photo would you say represents a truth about chickens, and which would you say represents a damaging fiction? And assuming that you choose the former as the truthful one, I asked a second question. I said, don't you think we owe it to children, who this game is targeted to tell them the truth about animals? My hope is that this slideshow is a snapshot of the often startling dynamic between the truths and fictions out there that are available to us if we want to see them. I have one last photo for you. Well, actually 2, but they're paired together. So this is Sweet Pea Gun, who passed away in July of 2013 of egg-laying complications. She unfortunately suffered quite a bit in her life, but she had the most gregarious and upbeat personality, and she was really very affectionate. Every time I'd come out into the yard and kneel down, she'd stop whatever she was doing out there and just come running over and want to jump into my lap and just be petted. She was incredibly interactive and affectionate. This is on the first day that I rescued her. She was sitting on the back porch with me, and she just sat at my feet and looked up at me every once in a while with a look that could only be described as true gratitude for taking her out of these horrible conditions where she was living. She wasn't in a cage system, but she was in a pretty terrible small farm type situation where she was scared of everything, dogs barking on the other side of a fence, and it just was not good. And then the picture on the right is her. This is the last time we spent any kind of quality time together before she died. She was sitting in my lap. But I'm showing you this because I really believe, again, that by showing truthful and authentic images like this one of Sweet Pea, we can help change the prevailing attitudes about animals and our relationship with them for the better. Thank you very much.